The Doctor Who universe has introduced the world to a number of scary villains. The Daleks, the Cybermen, the Silence, John Barrowman, the Weeping Angels. Whether they're annihilating all life on Earth, converting people into lifeless robots, sending you back in time, or just getting naked on set for no reason, they all have the capacity to be absolutely terrifying. It's pretty common to hear people reminisce about the fear they had when they watched the show during their childhood. The idea of kids hiding behind the sofa has been so closely linked to Doctor Who for nearly 60 years. Although sometimes we get a villain so good that even the adults are scared. For example, one of the most vivid early memories I have of the show was the general buzz surrounding the Weeping Angels after Blink aired in 2007. But for a show that pretty much introduces a new type of creature every week, it's interesting that so few have really made their way into the public consciousness. I guess it's because these Monster of the Week stories have a tendency to blur into one, unless there's a really great concept behind them. They're often about just running away from an alien for 40 minutes and then defeating it in the last 5. There's also usually a heavy reliance on a character like the Doctor telling people that this is the biggest and most mean baddie in the entire universe, and it can never be defeated. Which is what happens when the writers decide that show don't tell doesn't really apply to them, and represents a much bigger problem the show has with scale and importance. When an episode's sole focus is on how big and bad the enemy is, it ends up being just quite meh, no matter how good the design. Even then, those big evil baddies have never really had much of an impact on me. You can show me whatever grotesque and unsettling monster you want, and I'm not sure I'll ever be scared. I'd like to clarify that I'm not flexing. This isn't me like a kid on the playground claiming I'm really cool because I can watch Doctor Who without even having to shut my eyes. I've just never really been bothered.
Ooh. You're hard, showing off.
But there was one concept that really worked its way under my skin when I was a kid. I never had bad dreams about the Daleks, or the Cybermen, or whatever.
But that thing... it scares me.
Like I said, this isn't a bug-eyed monster or a man in a rubber mask. This is something stranger. And it all started when I watched a certain episode of the Sarah Jane Adventures. From the moment I saw it, I haven't really been able to stop thinking about the concepts it introduced. And I'd like to dive into why. Whatever Happened to Sarah Jane aired on the 29th of October 2007. For those of you that haven't seen it, I will be getting into spoilers, so maybe go and check it out if you're interested. Also, before continuing, I need to address a certain elephant in the room. Some of the episodes that I'm going to be talking about in this video were written by Gareth Roberts, who, if you don't know, is a worthless pile of garbage, and while I've decided that it won't stop me talking about this topic, I think it's important to say just a straight up and unambiguous fuck you to that guy before continuing. Trans rights are human rights, and people who don't understand this have no place in the world of Doctor Who. Back to the video. The episode starts with a kind of snapshot of the fun, good old times with the gang, hanging out at the skate park. It's always good to see the characters in a bit of downtime, even if it's just used to show the calm before the storm. As great as this episode and the Sarah Jane Adventures as a whole is, it is aimed at a younger audience. So we do get some pretty ham-fisted reminders that...
I can't help thinking if it wasn't for Sarah Jane, we'd all be dead.
I don't mind really, I'm sure it probably just meant that for the kids, the stakes were a bit clearer. Sarah Jane has this puzzle box, given to her by an alien she met like a week ago. She doesn't really know what it does, but was told to give it to the person she trusted the most, which she decides is Maria, a schoolgirl from across the road that she's known for a few weeks. Then, later that night, when everyone's tucked up in bed, a weird figure in a cloak walks into the street. He points at Sarah Jane's house and Sarah Jane's car, making the latter disappear, and then he himself disappears. The next morning, Maria wakes up and the world is the same as it ever was, except it isn't. She mentions Sarah Jane's son, Luke, and her dad has no idea who that is. And then he mentions this woman called Andrea, as if Maria should be familiar with her. And it turns out she lives in Sarah Jane's house, and apparently always has. No one has any knowledge of Sarah Jane Smith, Luke is nowhere to be seen, and Clyde hardly knows who Maria is. So, without any warning, Maria is just plummeted into a completely unknown world. And this, folks, was what really terrified me. Her whole life was flipped, turned upside down overnight. Her whole way of life had changed and she only remembered the real one because of the box. One of her 3 best friends didn't know her and the other 2 didn't even exist. And there was literally nothing she could do about it. I think it wasn't long after I saw this episode that I watched the Back to the Future trilogy. Part 2 has another great example of a character's world becoming completely awful and yeah, you can bet that scared me as well. Marty came back to 1985 to find new people living in his house, his father dead and his mother married to Donald J. Trump, who was also wielding immense power. For some reason I felt that it was a very plausible possibility that this could happen to me. Maybe not those specific circumstances, but you understand the point. It just seemed to me like the worst thing imaginable. Having the world shift around you as you stay the same. Your friends and family becoming unrecognizable as their memories change. At least with Marty, he knew he'd been time traveling, and he had the Doc, a super genius, on the same page as him. For Maria, it happened completely out of the blue, and she was on her own. She also had the annoying disadvantage of being a child. She was completely helpless. Who do you tell in that situation? What's the protocol. This element of childhood powerlessness is something that they loved getting into on CBBC shows, and it always really stressed me out. She told her dad, the person she loved and fully trusted, and he acted like she was insane. He wasn't rude and made an effort to understand, but you can hardly blame him for being concerned when from his perspective his daughter just woke up one day and demanded to know the whereabouts of a woman who doesn't exist. But from the perspective of our hero, she's the only one on the planet who has any idea what's going on, and she can't do anything to sort things out. On top of that, they chucked in the fact that a meteor was going to crash into the Earth later that day, and Sarah Jane was the only one who was going to be able to stop it. Which is fine. I guess the existential dread that comes from the fabric of reality being rewoven may not have been a concrete enough threat for a children's TV show, although it definitely was for me. I guess I was built different. As the story progresses, it becomes clear what has happened. Sarah Jane's childhood best friend, Andrea Yates, died in an accident in 1964.
Brixton's right. Me and Foon should...
And an evil baddie called the Trickster went back in time to offer her a chance at life, in an attempt to take Sarah Jane out of the picture and thrive in the chaos. All Andrea had to do was agree, and Sarah Jane would be the one to die instead. So it turns out we have an It's a Wonderful Life situation, a world without Sarah Jane. It was also around that time that I watched It's a Wonderful Life for the first time. The universe was determined to terrify me. The premise is made convincing by how well the cast portray the slightly different versions of themselves, and the gravity of the stakes is sold so well by Yasmin Page as Maria. It's such a quality performance from such a young actor, and she really carries the whole episode on her back. But there's also a very interesting performance from Jane Asher in the role of Andrea. I admit that as a child I wanted to murder her and bring Sarah Jane back, but I think I've developed a bit more of an understanding of nuance since then. She explains herself, how she felt knowing that she was about to die. Maria tells Andrea that she was the one who was supposed to die, and Andrea points out the ridiculousness of that statement. How was she, a 13-year-old kid, in any way supposed to die? And that's some pretty heavy stuff for a kids show. It would be easy to see her as the villain, killing Sarah Jane and stealing her life, but could you really blame her? I honestly find it impossible to hate her, although I do think she takes it a bit too far once Maria figures her out and she tells the Trickster to make her disappear. The episode becomes a bit more generic and a bit less atmospheric when Jimmy V shows up to kidnap Maria and take her to a weird sky place. But it does coincide with Maria's dad Alan having his own moment where everyone else forgets his daughter ever existed, which I do think is done very well, and it was probably much more horrifying for the parents in the audience. Quick little side note, I just wanted to point out this fantastic detail that happens once the world has forgotten Maria, and Alan's memories are still being protected by the puzzle box. There's a song playing at Andrea's party, and not only is it from 1964, the same year as her accident, the lyrics are...
You what? Danny, are you serious? Alright, we'll check it out.
Anyway, when the plot starts wrapping up and the science of it all is explained, it becomes a bit less scary. Very clever, very intriguing, but not as horrifying. But we do get Alan taking someone out with his skateboard, which seems like it was worth sacrificing the horror for. It ends with Andrea realizing she has to sacrifice herself to bring Sarah Jane back and save the world from the asteroid. So she tells the Trickster she goes back on her agreement, and goes back to having died in 1964, and the world is saved. It's a fantastic conclusion to a fantastic story. The Trickster himself is just a perfect villain. Not necessarily because of the character himself, but more the idea of him, and what he does to the universe and the characters. And sure, the design isn't enough to make me want to cower behind any living room furniture. But at the same time, I wouldn't say he was particularly pleasant to look at. The image of this hooded figure with a faceless face and jagged teeth is very striking, and when you pair it with his abilities, you've got yourself a top-tier baddie. I also appreciate the fact that his goal is chaos and destruction rather than power and domination. He has an interesting dynamic with Sarah Jane. He seems to really appreciate how important her life was, but it doesn't feel like respect. It's more like he's hungry for her potential. He touches a bit on what he might do in the future, using the absence of Sarah Jane to get to the Doctor and take him out of the timeline. A universe without the Doctor is a terrifying concept, and one that they didn't let go to waste, but we'll get to that. The last aspect of the Trickster I think works really well is the element of temptation and choice. In Andrea's position, who knows what you'd do? He's a villain that relies solely on human weakness, offering personal benefit through altering the smallest changes, but with enormous consequences. It tapped into this deep-rooted anxiety I had. I was probably too young to be thinking about it so much, but the idea that every decision in time travel creates ripples that can have catastrophic consequences on the future meant only one thing, that the same goes for all decisions. It makes you feel like you're just one wrong call away from a meteor destroying the planet. I think because of the dual concept at play in a Trickster story, the fear this episode episode brought out in me was kind of doubled. Not only do you have the unimaginable terror of an altered reality, you also have the suggestion of how easy it would be to make a decision that leads you to that kind of world. Whether it's just through a bad judgment call or whether you're tempted into it. Both feed into each other and both are rather frightening. The full storytelling potential of this temptation aspect wasn't fully reached in the first Trickster story. And in fairness, it wasn't really the focus. The character making that call wasn't who the episode was following. But what if she was? The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith was released on the 17th of November 2008, less than 1 year after the original Trickster story. While that episode looked at the consequences of making a deal with the Trickster, this follow-up shined a spotlight on the choice itself. When a little boy from the olden days comes out of a magic time portal in London, the gang help him get home. When Sarah Jane steps through the portal, she realises it leads to the village where she lived with her parents as a baby. And it's a mere month before they abandoned her and died in a car crash. Against all her better judgment, she decides to go and meet them. It's really great to have an episode that gives Sarah Jane so much attention. Although she's the main character of the show, we rarely got such a good example of a story that delved into her wants, needs, and struggles. It's the kind of scenario where she really needs the doctor, a fact that she herself admits when she thinks she's found him.
It's me! Doctor!
You won't find a doctor in here, my love. What do you want?
She at least needs someone to tell her not to do it. She usually acts as the calm voice of reason, but this situation is so personal to her that she's unable to resist the urge. These stories are so clever because they go straight for the jugular when it comes to what makes the characters tick. The moment when Sarah Jane meets her parents, seeing that they absolutely adored her, and then realising that she's accidentally gone back to the day they die is like a punch in the gut. Visiting them months before their death would have been hard enough, but having to make the decision to actively let them die is impossible. And obviously, she can't help but save the lives of her parents. You could be grumpy and say, wow, she should have known the time travel was dangerous, but there's no way you can't empathise with that decision. It's easy to sit back and say, if I was there with my kids, it wouldn't have went down the way it did, but in her position, I can't think of many people who wouldn't have done the same. It's so unusual seeing Sarah Jane, the character who's pretty much always in control, falling apart and being forced into a situation where she knows what she's doing is wrong, but still can't stop herself. At times, it's actually a lot like the Time Lord Victorious scenes from The Waters of Mars.
Why do we have to think this is something terrible? What if this is a good thing? All these years I've been putting other people first. There has to be something at the end of it, doesn't there? Something for me. What if this is it? My reward.
It is, of course, a trap. The Trickster set up the whole thing, and the result is the world going into generic post-apocalyptic mode, complete with a destroyed Big Ben. I actually find this way less effective than the previous story's parallel time, when everything was the same in most ways, but catastrophically different on a personal level. I think there's something somewhat relatable about that, a science fiction adaptation of being abandoned by your friends and family. But the world ending? That's pretty standard stuff. But like I said, the main point of this two-parter is the actual act of bargaining, however indirectly, with the Trickster. I will say it is a tad disappointing that the consequences aren't directly related to Sarah's parents surviving. It's more that it just causes a crack in time and allows the Trickster to come through and rule the world, which I'm not sure was ever really his thing. Mining the planet down for minerals just doesn't seem like his MO. I guess the whole point of it though is to get revenge on Sarah Jane, the victim of his scheme this time, rather than just a tool to create chaos. And running her planet into the ground is pretty good revenge. He's very much hamming it up in those interactions with her.
You gave me the power to walk this world. You gave this planet to the Trickster.
And I have to say that he really is a nice looking baddie. Obviously not nice, but it's definitely a memorable look. I feel like they slightly darkened his eyes in this one. I think that was a good call. Something that is really great about these episodes is how they force the other characters to step up in the absence of Sarah Jane. First Maria, now Clyde and Rani. The plots are so character driven when the threat is so personal. Clyde even has a good bit where he makes my entire point for me.
I always thought, I don't know, all in a day's work. Because it was scary and brilliant all at the same time. But this is different. We're in an alternative timeline. Our world never existed. So how do we get back home from here?
The episode ends in the only way it could have, but that doesn't stop it from being one of the most effective emotional scenes in the whole series, maybe even in all of the Doctor Who universe. Sarah Jane's parents figure out who she is and realise what they have to do. Sarah Jane doesn't force them to do it, she never could, but they do it themselves to save their daughter and the world. Her parents have to say goodbye to their baby daughter and the version of her that is even older than they are. It's such a heartbreaking and beautiful moment. If you want to be smart and boring, you could say, so you're telling me there's a time travel story about an iconic Doctor Who companion going back to visit her parents on the day they were killed in a car accident, and she saves them, destroying time in the process, but they end up sacrificing themselves and saving the day anyway. How original. And yeah, when you break the story down to just its basic beats, it does seem a lot like Father's Day. But why would you consume media in a way that makes you want to break things down into plot bullet points? It's silly. Who even cares about the plot? I'm here for the story. What matters is the characters and their emotions, and how effectively those emotions are conveyed. And in that department, this is another great episode, made possible by this phenomenal idea for a villain. The Trickster made one more appearance in the show. We'd had one episode showing what happens after a deal is made with the Trickster, and another showing the events leading up to making that deal. So what did the wedding of Sarah Jane Smith do to push the character and idea into a new direction? Nothing. Okay, maybe that isn't fair. It's definitely the weakest of the three stories, but it's still very good. In a lot of ways, however, it retreads the same ground as The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith. Just like that one, Sarah Jane is given a lot of attention as a character. The new angle is that it's not her parents in the situation, it's the man she loves. The fact she is in love is kind of strange to see. I think when you're young, you forget that adults are real people, so this is a nice reminder. I think the kids in the episode had the exact same experience. So this lovely man, Peter Dalton, proposes to Sarah Jane, and their wedding happens 1 week after. And it all goes normally, up until the point where they say, if any person has any objection to them being together, speak now or forever hold your peace. When this happens. I like to think the Doctor knew that it was really important to stop the wedding as soon as possible, but was also waiting outside for a few minutes just so he could run in at the right dramatic moment. The Trickster shows up wearing white. Sarah Jane and Peter vanish, as do all the guests. There's a dimensional shift, and the Doctor, Clyde, Rani, Luke, and K9 end up stuck in a single second on an infinite loop. The wedding venue ends up in what I think is probably the least interesting place possible, nowhere. It transpires that Peter was in an accident and was visited by the Trickster as he was about to die. He offered Peter a life if they worked together to set him up with Sarah Jane. So, our main character is faced with another choice. She can either force him to go back on his deal, meaning he'll die, or she can get married to him, going on to lead a normal life, forgetting her job fighting aliens. My issue with this setup is that the big danger is the world without Sarah Jane, which we've already seen, and the solution is Sarah Jane's loved ones decide to save the world and die, which we've already seen. As familiar as it is, I really do love how much this story puts a strain on Sarah Jane. In the show, she's rarely faced with ethical dilemmas that involve trading lives. It's a kids show after all. But in the Trickster story, she has to deal with that on top of the fact the people whose lives will be sacrificed are the people she loves. Although he was working with the Trickster, Peter really did love Sarah Jane, and she really did love him. Despite its similarities to that of the previous episode, the resolution to this story does work. I think a lot of it comes down to the performances by Liz Sladen and Nigel Havers. They really make you believe that they're made for each other. Also, if I had a nickel for every time in the Doctor Who universe that a Nigel Havers character kept a deadly secret from his wife by trapping her in a time loop during a special occasion,
I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
on the whole, it's not a bad story at all. I don't think it really lives up to the Trickster's full potential. I would have liked to have seen more of him and understood his endgame, but it definitely shows the personal impact this villain can have. Thanks to the Doctor, we get some world building and history on the Trickster. We're told that he's part of the Pantheon of Discord, which in today's context sounds very sinister. So, on the whole, these are 3 pretty great stories that take advantage of a terrifying sci-fi concept, and I think we need to see more of it. I'm not saying they should oversaturate it, but I'm sure there are more stories to tell. Obviously, the Sarah Jane Adventures isn't being made anymore, so this is more of a suggestion for the main show. And you might be thinking, Joe, what are you talking about? The show has made use of this concept. What about the Monk trilogy? What about Turn Left? And you'd be right, I should probably talk about these episodes and explain why they don't quite scratch this very specific itch. Turn Left is a story that was seemingly inspired by the line in the first Trickster episode about removing the Doctor from the timeline. Tapping into that sliding doors butterfly effect idea that life could have gone so differently if just one small detail was changed, we see how differently Donna's story would have played out if she had one day turned right instead of left at a crossroads. It's a masterpiece, and it is genuinely distressing to watch so many of the stories from previous episodes end with the worst case scenario. After the Doctor is killed fighting the Rachnos, so many awful disasters take place, and pretty much every other goodie on Earth dies trying to do the Doctor's job. Torchwood are wiped out, Martha Jones dies before even becoming a companion, Sarah Jane and the gang all die, and the icing on the miserable cake is the famous labour camp scene, which is probably the darkest place the show has ever gone to. It's a phenomenal piece of storytelling in its own right, but I would say the one thing that prevents it from being a great example of a Trickster-esque story is that no one in-universe knows how things are meant to go. We follow Donna, but she's a parallel Donna, from from the same parallel universe that she's in. She's not an audience insert reacting to this new world, she's just a regular person reacting to how shitty things have become. But she's completely unaware of how things are supposed to be. We don't have a Maria to come with us on this powerless journey of rewritten time. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean this as a criticism of the episode. It just means it doesn't elicit quite the same feeling of anxiety. And it's why I don't think it can join the ranks of the traumatizing Trickster trilogy. Which is a good thing too, because I'd have to change the acronym if it did. The Time Beetle we see in this episode is actually part of the Trickster Brigade, which sounds like a very cool group with a very silly name. The only other indication we have about what they get up to is in a Torchwood episode, when an alien brain parasite was prevented from killing FDR. The plan was to prevent America joining in World War II so the Nazis could win. Now, I don't want to get political, but that would have been bad. But also, it would have been an interesting story to see play out in full. The other times the series has brought in parallel worlds have been great, but nothing like the kind of story you get with the Trickster. Pete's World made for some really interesting storytelling, but the focus was never on, everything's different and we're trapped. I guess the we're trapped part did become relevant at the end of Doomsday though. In 1970, Inferno did give us a bit of that before the Trickster even existed, throwing the Doctor into a version of Earth run by an evil dictator, where his best friends were ruthless tools of fascism. On paper, it sounds like the perfect story to satisfy my desire for more trickstery content, but as fantastic as it is, the main threat of the story has more to do with the big drill than it does with the horrifying baddie universe. There's also the character of the meddling monk, who is a lot like the Trickster in that he wants to meddle with history, but is a lot less scary and more playful. He seems to just want mischief, and we never get a good look at the consequences of his work. The last and most recent example of a trickstery story is the Monk trilogy from Series 10, specifically The Lie of the Land, and I have some thoughts. The first chapter of this three-parter, Extremis, was set entirely in a simulation, as the monks plan their invasion using a simulated world, which, side note, is very cool. The second episode showed the monks arriving in the real world, informing everyone that they've run the simulations and discovered that the world would be completely devoid of life within a year. They offer to take over the world and prevent this from happening, and they require consent from humanity to do so. Eventually, they get it from Bill. She gave it because they were offering to help the Doctor. He was trapped in a lab that was about to explode and couldn't escape because he was too blind to use the combination lock. So they restored his sight, which was good, but took over the planet, which was bad. Then the next episode, The Lie of the Land, threw us right in. The proverbial shit had already hit the proverbial fan. Although I'm not sure you can call the shit hits the fan a proverb. That seems awfully generous. I love the world we are shown in this episode. The monks have fully taken control and have rewritten history. Not in a literal sense like the Trickster did, but through a mixture of propaganda and mind control, convincing everyone that they've always been part of human history. And we have our audience insert. Some people, including Bill, remember the truth, but can't do anything about it, evoking that same sense of powerlessness that was felt by Maria. In her case, it was because she was a child, but in the case of Bill, it's the fact that speaking out gets you a one-way ticket to the monk-run labour camps.
With no return ticket!
And the majority of people don't remember. Nardole gets a bit political, telling Bill it's easier to keep people oppressed when the oppressors are the ones writing history.
However bad a situation is, if people think that's how it's always been, they put up with it. It's 90% of the job done.
It almost goes without saying at this point that a setup like this really lets the characters shine. Bill steps up in the absence of the Doctor just as Maria, Clyde and Rani did in the absence of Sarah Jane. Her ability to ground herself, maintaining her memories and personality ended up coming in quite handy at the end of the series. And she also has what I consider to be her defining moment in Doctor Who. She finds the Doctor and he tells her that he's joined the monks to save humanity from themselves. She realises that if he really is working with the monks, then there will be no hope of ever stopping them. So she shoots him. Bill Potts, the Doctor's best friend, who spent 6 months waiting for him to show up and save the day, killed him without a moment's hesitation when she thought he was going to help keep humanity oppressed for the rest of eternity. That's some of the best character stuff they've ever done in the show, and it's the kind of storytelling that is made possible by a huge game-changing threat like this. Obviously, it's all a test to see if Bill is really resisting the monks, but it doesn't change how far she was willing to go. I said that these Doctor Who episodes that dealt with trickstery concepts didn't quite scratch the specific itch I've had since I first fell in love with this narrative device. But honestly, Lie of the Land really comes close. The fact they had to give consent to the monks is very similar to the deals the characters were making with the Trickster. I love when a foe takes over in a way other than force. I would say it's probably more unsettling when the villains don't invade with big guns. It was quite scary seeing the world be taken over without anyone noticing, by a group of fascists who rooted themselves into culture, spreading misinformation, controlling the narrative, and convincing people that the only life that's possible is the miserable one that they're currently being given. And it was quite scary when it happened in Doctor Who as well. Even the design of the monks is quite trickstery, but they're just a bit more gruesome and corpsey. And interesting that they're monks, just like the classic Who character who did similar things. It's probably just a coincidence, but maybe they're related. Unlike the Trickster, you can't just back out of the deal you made. We find out through Missy that the best way to get rid of the monks is to kill the person who created the link with them. So, just like all 3 Trickster episodes, and indeed Turn Left, the solution involves sacrificing a life. In this case, the life of Bill Potts. So we have the perfect 2/3 of the story. Everything is going well. Now the stage is set for a really gut-wrenching and difficult resolution. And I have to say, they messed it up. Don't for a moment think that I'm saying they should have killed Bill off in this episode. If you know me, you know how much I love the stuff they did with her later on in the series. But I do wish there had been some interesting consequences. Because the real resolution is just a bunch of soldiers shooting their way into Monk HQ and Bill holding a monk's head and thinking about her mum until things are back to normal. Yeah, there's a moment of what Bill thinks is self-sacrifice, but it falls flat for me. It's honestly really disappointing, and the reason I can't rank this episode up there with the Trickster ones. I do want to re-emphasise though just how perfect I think the first 2 acts of Lie of the Land are. But trust me, no matter how much you adore the first 2/3 of a story, the whole thing is going to leave a bitter taste in your mouth if part 3 comes along and disappoints you. Whether that's because the whole thing was instantly saved by Bill's mum, or because they wrote out Rose and made Rey a Palpatine and killed off Ben Solo, and ended the entire trilogy on Tatooine for no reason other than nostalgia, with no indication of what the actual main characters of this trilogy will be doing after the film. So yeah, Doctor Who. We need more episodes like this. Preferably ones with good endings, please. I would say that the main series should 100% bring the Trickster himself back, because if he was used creatively enough, he could absolutely stand up there with the big dogs as one of the best Doctor Who villains. To be honest, I think he already does, despite never appearing. But there is a spanner in the works, and it's Gareth Roberts, the man who created the Trickster and wrote these 3 episodes that featured him. I don't think the show will ever want anything to do with him again. After it came out that he was a big bastard, he was removed from a collection of short stories. Not only that, but the man doesn't deserve to work on Doctor Who ever again. If bringing the Trickster back would mean they had to pay or consult him, then they should just introduce a new villain with the same effect. I've said multiple times in this video that it's less about him and more about what he does to the plot and the characters. The glimpses of these unpleasant parallel worlds scared me to death as a kid, and the level of intriguing and emotionally satisfying character development that these stories have has really impressed me as an adult. I'm not sure anyone but the super nerds would mind if they introduced a brand new character called the Liar or the Mischief Man, who is essentially a new Trickster. In fact, if you want to please the lore junkies, just say he's the Trickster's brother or something. Part of the pantheon of Discord mods or whatever they're called. I honestly wouldn't mind if they just fully redid these Trickster stories in Doctor Who. The fact that it was done by a spin-off 15 years ago doesn't mean that it wouldn't be great, especially with new characters and new consequences. So that's what they should do. I feel like I'm making a lot of demands to Chris Chibnall or whoever's in charge of Doctor Who. I hope this has been something. You can probably tell that this is an aspect of the Whoniverse that I really love, as well as just finding it frightening. I really hope we do see more of this kind of thing, in whatever form it takes. I'm just waiting for that perfect Doctor Who story to come along and scratch that itch. So far, the only piece of content that has really done it for me has been the episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer called The Wish. It has absolutely everything I'm looking for, and may just have been the inspiration for those original Trickster stories. I just want more, and I want it in Doctor Who, and I hope now you understand why. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot because this video ended up being much longer than I planned. I just constantly became inspired to write more. I hope my passion came across because I really love these episodes and feel strongly about the potential for more. If you did enjoy, please leave a like and let me know in the comments how you feel about these episodes and this villain. If you're not already, please subscribe and hit that bell. Is that what people are still saying on YouTube? Is that to like 2017? And if you're interested in watching more of me, I recently featured in a great video all about Doctor Who's missing episodes. Check that out as well. I'll put it on the card here and in the description. Oh, and follow me on Twitter. Link is in the description. A link to my Twitter, I mean, not the Zelda character. Although maybe he's there too. Love you lots. See you in 2 weeks.